The cowboy took off his hat. The sun was high, the wind dry, the dust swirling like ghosts. A line of Japanese women stood by the barn, their uniforms tattered, eyes downcast. No one spoke. Not the guards, not the girls, not even the wind. And then he said one word, "Home." The woman flinched, not like she'd been struck, but like she'd been seen. Her hand, bandaged and trembling, moved to her chest. Her eyes locked on his. Something shifted in her face, barely a breath, barely a blink, but it cracked the stillness like thunder. Behind her, another girl dropped the cup she'd been holding. The clang echoed. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Even the ranch dogs stopped barking. They had all been told the enemy was inhuman, that compassion was treason. But now, in the middle of a Texas cattle ranch turned prison camp, one word had shattered the distance between two worlds, and in that silence, something old began to die, and something new, dangerous, uncertain, began to live. The truck sputtered once more before the engine died, its cough dissolving into the hush of the Texas heat. Dust hung thick in the air, unmoving, as if the world itself were holding its breath. A line of women stepped down one by one, their uniforms threadbare, their steps uneven, their eyes fixed on nothing. They moved like shadows, like a memory already fading. Behind them the truck's back gate clanged shut with a finality that sounded too much like a door locking. And beyond the gate, no fences, no towers, just the endless sweep of sun-baked fields and a few wooden buildings slouched in the distance like they too had survived a war. The cowboys didn't speak at first. They stood at a distance, leaning against fence posts and barn doors, boots half buried in the dust, rifles slung loose but ready. They were not soldiers, not in the polished sense. Their hats were sweat-stained, their shirts rolled to the elbows, and their silence was not the silence of strategy, but confusion. This wasn't what they'd been told to expect. These weren't warriors. These weren't fanatics. These were girls. One of the women, perhaps 19, perhaps older, perhaps younger, stumbled slightly as she stepped down. Her braid was unraveling. Her sleeves were too long. She carried nothing. A medic moved forward with a clipboard and a guarded face. He read off names slowly, mispronouncing half of them. The women nodded or didn't. Some didn't react at all. They weren't being defiant. They were simply too tired. The ranch smelled of manure, wood smoke, and heat, the kind of dry heat that pressed against your skin without sweat. A horse snorted from behind the barn, and somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent again. The women lined up shoulder to shoulder, but their posture had no rigidity. Their backs sloped inward like trees in windless air. That's when he stepped forward, not a medic, not an officer, just a cowboy, maybe in his 30s. Sun-reddened neck, boots worn near through. He had been watching the youngest of them, a girl with dirt on her cheek and blood on her sock. Her shoes were mismatched. She blinked slowly, like someone not quite awake. He took off his hat, held it against his chest. Then he looked straight at her and said one word, "Home." That was all. The effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just stillness. The girl froze. Her face didn't change at first, but something behind her eyes sparked, like a wick catching fire under glass. She took a half-step back, as if the word had weight. Her lips parted slightly, though no sound came out. Behind her, another prisoner gasped. A tin can dropped from someone's hand and clattered across the dirt, the metal rolling into silence. The cowboy didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't explain. The guards shifted uneasily. The medic looked up from his clipboard. A crow somewhere overhead let out a single sharp caw, and even that seemed too loud. No one knew what. had happened exactly. But something had happened, something human. Later, they would try to explain it, to chalk it up to language confusion or nerves or hunger, but they all knew that word, that single syllable, had cracked something, not just in the girl, but in the air itself. It wasn't that home was a kind word, it was that it wasn't supposed to be said here, not by him, not to her. She didn't speak, she didn't cry, but the way she held her shoulders, suddenly straighter, and the way she looked, not down but forward, made everyone in the yard realize the war hadn't ended all at once. Not for them. It was ending now, slowly, one moment at a time, and in that moment they all stood still, not as enemies, not as victors and prisoners, but as people, silent, uncertain, breathing the same dust under the same sky. Before the dust of Texas ever touched her skin, before the cowboy ever spoke, she had been told what would happen if she was captured. It would begin with humiliation, then torture, then death. That was the order. Maybe not always in that order, but always all three. They would defile her, strip her, laugh as they broke her down to nothing. The officers had said it without blinking, not as a threat, as a certainty, as law. She was 15 the first time she heard it, standing in the courtyard of a military hospital just outside Nagoya, her hair tucked beneath her cap, a ration biscuit in her pocket, and the sky above smeared with smoke from a factory fire. She was not a soldier, not truly. She was support, a Taishantai, a volunteer, a body the Empire could use. She carried bandages, scrubbed bloody sheets, boiled water, and sometimes held down boys no older than herself while their legs were cut off. They called it honor. The girls weren't given rifles. They were given rules. Endure pain. Never show weakness. If capture is imminent, take your own life. If you fail, you are no longer Japanese. You are shame. One officer held up a photograph once, burned around the edges, barely intact. A young woman in rags, her hands tied, her face hollowed out. "This," he said, "is what happens when you let the enemy decide your fate." They passed the photo around like a warning. No one spoke, but in every girl's eyes was the same message. That won't be me. The air raids came often. Kiyomi remembered the first one that took her school. A low whine, then the shriek of firebombs. She remembered pressing her body flat to the ground, her face buried in her arms, feeling the heat of buildings die behind her. After that, she didn't run anymore. She learned to freeze. Her mother boiled weeds for supper. Her brother went off to fight and never wrote back. When the war turned against them, no one said it out loud, but they all knew. Then one day the orders changed. The commanding officer didn't shout. He didn't look them in the eye. He simply walked in and said, "Pack what you can. You're being relocated." No one asked where. Some wept silently. Others just stared. Kiyomi folded her blood-smeared apron and tucked it into her satchel. She left her shoes behind. They were falling apart anyway. They were loaded onto trucks like freight, crammed shoulder to shoulder with girls who hadn't spoken in days. The road to the harbor was lined with children digging through rubble, old men sleeping beside empty rice sacks, and buildings half swallowed by vines and ash. When they arrived, the enemy was there. Tall, pale-skinned Marines with strange eyes and even stranger silence. They didn't bark. They didn't strike. They handed out paper tags and water. The fear didn't lift. It deepened. Why weren't they cruel? The ship was clean. That was the first offense. Clean floors, bunks, real food on metal trays. Kiyomi sat beside a porthole and watched Japan disappear like smoke across the ocean's skin. Her hands trembled for hours. On the second day, someone handed her a towel, a bar of soap. The smell was sweet. It made her stomach twist. The sea was a long ache. She didn't eat much. She couldn't. To swallow food from the hands of her enemy was to betray something sacred, but her body didn't care. It was starving. So she ate, quietly, slowly, eyes down, shame pressing hard against every bite. At night, the other girls lay awake, whispering in the dark. They'll keep us as trophies. They'll parade us in front of crowds. They're just waiting to break us down. Kiyomi said nothing. She watched the ceiling and counted the rivets. But no one came with ropes. No one came with cameras. The guards outside the bunks smoked in silence, sometimes laughing with one another. There were no shouts, no footsteps running, just the hush of the ocean. And then, after what felt like forever, land. Not a prison, not a cage, just a stretch of flat earth, low hills, and a sky wider than any she had ever seen, and men in boots and wide-brimmed hats who looked more like farmers than jailers. She stepped off the ramp and blinked against the sunlight, and from behind her someone whispered, "It smells like horses." She didn't understand yet, but already something was unraveling, not loudly, not with fire, quietly, like thread slipping from a wound. The barn door creaked as it swung open, hinges long since worn smooth by years of wind and work. Inside, the light was dim, golden from the late sun slanting through wooden slats. Dust floated in the air like it didn't know where to land. Kiyomi stepped inside slowly, her eyes adjusting, her hands still clutched to her sides. No one barked at her, no orders, just a nod from the cowboy who led her there and a small gesture toward the far corner. There was a bed of hay, neatly stacked, not thrown. Atop it sat a folded wool blanket, gray-green like army uniforms, but clean. A stove in the center of the barn glowed faintly, red coals pulsing like a quiet heart. She stopped a few steps from the bed and looked around. It wasn't a cell. It wasn't a cage. There were no bars, just animals breathing in nearby stalls, the low sound of a horse shifting, and the soft creak of the wind against the roof. She sat, slowly. The hay crackled beneath her weight, but it didn't scratch. It was soft. Not a cot, not the cold floor of a bunker. Something else, something offered. Her hands moved to the blanket, hesitant. The fabric was thick, still warm from the sun. She ran her fingers across it, then pulled it to her chest, suddenly overwhelmed by the scent of soap and wool. She held it tighter, as if someone might come and take it back. No one did. No one had told her she could have it, but no one had told her she couldn't. In her world, nothing belonged to her. Not really. Uniforms were state-issued, food was rationed. Even her body, her labor, her breath, her silence, had been handed over to the war effort like property. But this blanket, this heavy, folded square of fabric, was on her bed, her hay, and no one had pulled it from her grasp. She wrapped it around her shoulders like a shield, like armor that didn't clink or shine, but whispered, "You are allowed to be warm." The stove crackled softly, casting thin shadows along the barn wall. Somewhere behind her, a calf stirred, then stilled again. She didn't know if she was allowed to lie down. She didn't know if this was a test, but her legs ached. Her ribs burned. Her eyes blinked too often. So she did, slowly, carefully. She lay down on the hay, the blanket tucked beneath her chin, her face turned toward the wooden beams above. She stared at the ceiling like it might fall. Stillness was the most frightening part. No bombs, no boots stomping, no shouting officers, no coughing, no sobbing, no whimpering behind canvas walls. Just the low hum of fire, the occasional snort of livestock, the muffled voices of guards outside talking softly, not about them, not to them, just talking. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket so tightly her knuckles paled. Her breath was shallow. It wasn't pain that unsettled her. Pain, she knew. Hunger, she understood. Orders she could obey. But this strange offering of warmth and silence, it was foreign, dangerous. It meant the world she knew might not be the only one. She blinked again. A tear slipped sideways along her cheek, into the hay. She didn't wipe it away. Hours passed, like water moving under ice, slow, soundless, unnoticed, until it was already gone. And then, somehow, she was asleep. No commands, no cold jolting her awake, no nightmares, just breath, blanket, warmth. When morning came, the sun touched her face. The horses shuffled in their stalls. A dog barked once outside, and the blanket was still there, folded loosely around her shoulders. No one had taken it. That was the first miracle. The second came in the form of a tin cup. It was offered to her just past sunrise, when the shadows still stretched long across the barn floor and the air carried the faint chill of night. The same cowboy from the day before. She didn't know his name, only the way he walked with slow boots and eyes that never lingered, approached with something steaming in his hands. He crouched by the stove again, ladled from a dented pot, then turned toward her without a word. He didn't come close this time. He just set the cup on the edge of her crate, near the tin basin and the soap she still hadn't used. The smell hit her first. Rich, warm, meaty. It was the kind of scent that made her body lean forward before her mind could stop it. She froze halfway, ashamed of the instinct. Her stomach clenched, not with disgust, but longing. The steam curled upward, carrying whispers of onion, beef, carrot, things she hadn't tasted in over a year. She looked at it like it might be a trick. Poison, a trap, a test. Back home, they'd eaten roots boiled in water until the pot was empty and the water still clear. A single grain of rice was a treasure. Soup was something you imagined. Now, in enemy hands, it was real. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. Her fingers twitched, but her pride held firm. She had been taught that to accept anything from the enemy was the same as surrendering your soul. Kindness was the first lure, and she wasn't foolish enough to fall for it. But her body betrayed her. The hunger clawed upward, chewing through her will. Her hands trembled, her mouth watered. She looked at the other women in the barn, and they looked back, each one frozen in the same battle between memory and need. Someone, farther down the row, reached first. A sip, a small one, then another. Kiyomi's eyes dropped to her own cup again. The steam was thinner now, curling less. The surface shimmered with a thin trace of oil. She swallowed hard and reached out. The metal was warm. She lifted it slowly, brought it close. The scent was so strong now it almost made her dizzy. Her lips brushed the edge. She hesitated, and then she drank. The first sip burned, not from heat, but from disbelief. It was thick, salty, rich in ways she barely remembered. The fat hit her tongue like a punch. The beef, real beef, broke apart between her teeth with terrifying softness. She couldn't help it. She let out the smallest involuntary sound. Not quite a sigh, not quite a whimper, something in between. She pulled the cup back and stared into it as if seeing her reflection might tell her what to feel. She should have felt grateful, or maybe cautious, but what she felt was shame. Her mother, if she was still alive, was probably boiling bark for dinner. Her neighbors back home were thin as shadows. The little boy who used to sit 2 doors down had cried once when given a slice of potato. He wouldn't know what to do with this. And here she was. The enemy had fed her. The stew settled into her stomach like heat through winter clothes, and with it came something colder, guilt. A girl nearby licked her spoon clean, then looked away, as if afraid anyone had seen her enjoy it. Another pretended not to eat, but her hand shook each time it moved to her mouth. Kiyomi took another sip, slower this time. The kindness was too sharp, too clean. It didn't make sense. She had prepared herself for violence, for hunger, even for death. But not this. This was harder, because kindness from an enemy wasn't mercy. It was betrayal. Of everything she'd believed, of everyone who had starved, of the voice in her head that said, "You don't deserve this." But she kept eating, quietly, carefully, like every bite was a lie she wanted to believe. When the cup was empty, she set it down with shaking hands and wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But somewhere deep inside, something else unraveled, thread by thread, bite by bite. It started with a sound she didn't recognize, a twang, sharp and playful, followed by the high, reedy note of something metallic. Then came the rhythm, uneven but deliberate, joined by a burst of laughter that rang too freely, too easily. Kiyomi blinked awake. The sun had barely begun to spill through the barn slats, yet the noise floated in like smoke through cracks in the wood. Music. It took her a moment to understand it. Music was something distant, half remembered from childhood festivals in a country that no longer existed. Her brother used to hum war songs before being shipped off. After that, silence had become normal. Silence was safe. But this sound, it was alive. A banjo, maybe? A harmonica? Rough voices singing in English, words she couldn't make out, but the tone unmistakable. Joy. She sat up, her blanket falling around her waist. Outside, the barn doors were slightly ajar. The music grew louder, and with it came a smell. She froze. It hit her like a wave, salty, smoky, rich. Bacon. The scent clawed straight into her brain, bypassing language and memory, and went straight to the ache in her stomach. Her mouth watered instantly. Her ribs tightened. The memory of hunger rose like bile. She crawled to the doors and peeked through the slats. A group of men, cowboys, soldiers, something in between, were clustered around a small fire just past the mess tent. One held a pan, grease sizzling and popping inside. Another tapped his boot to the rhythm, mouth stretched wide in a grin as he strummed his banjo. A third leaned back on a crate, chewing a toothpick, head tipped to the sky, as he laughed at something someone said. Kiyomi watched, heart pounding. This wasn't war. This wasn't even discipline. It was normal, a kind of peace she had never imagined, and it terrified her. The scent wrapped itself around her, cruel and warm. The fat in the air seemed to whisper that she had survived, only to arrive in a world that didn't match the rules she'd lived by. Someone tapped her shoulder gently. Another girl, older, silent. She held out a tin plate with 2 slices of bacon and a chunk of bread. She didn't speak, she didn't smile. She just placed it in Kiyomi's hands and walked away. Kiyomi stared at the plate like it might detonate. She remembered her mother's hands, trembling as they folded thin slices of daikon into rice for her brother. She remembered hunger so loud it kept her awake. She remembered a time when meat was something whispered about, a ghost from the past. Now it was here, hot, crisped at the edges, real. She picked up the bacon with her fingers. It was warm, too warm. She bit. The grease burst against her tongue, the salt clinging to her teeth. Her eyes burned. She chewed slowly, painfully, as if the act itself might betray someone she loved. Then the tears came. She didn't sob, she didn't wail, just sat there, bent over her plate, chewing and crying as quietly as she could. Around her the music kept playing. The fire popped. A cowboy sneezed and another laughed at him. It made no sense. These were supposed to be monsters, but monsters didn't laugh like that. They didn't hum and play harmonicas. They didn't fry bacon and hand it out without punishment. The sound of laughter was worse than silence. It cut deeper, because it meant they weren't just pretending, they were at peace, and she didn't know what to do with that. So she ate, and cried, and waited for punishment, but it never came. Instead, they handed her a pencil. It happened in the quiet of late morning, when the sun had already climbed high enough to warm the barn roof, and the horses outside shifted lazily in their stalls. One of the soldiers, young, with sandy hair and eyes that squinted kindly, approached without boots pounding, without rifle in hand. Just a folded piece of lined paper and a short, stubby pencil. He knelt, slowly, like not to frighten her, and held them out. "You can write," he said softly, "if you want." Kiyomi stared. Her first thought wasn't what to say. It was why. Why offer her anything? Why now? Why words? She didn't move, didn't blink. The soldier placed the paper and pencil gently on the crate beside her and stood again. He gave a small nod, like someone handing off a fragile animal, and walked away. She looked at the paper like it might dissolve. Her hand hovered above the pencil but didn't touch it. It wasn't that she didn't want to write. It was that she didn't remember how. Not the letters, not the form, those she knew, but the practice, the shape of thought distilled into something worth sending across an ocean. It had been years since she had written anything for herself. For the empire? Yes. For duty? Yes. But for her family? Her mother? Never. And now, suddenly, someone said she could. She picked up the pencil. It was warm from the sun. She ran her fingers along the ridges where a knife had sharpened it to a point. There was something deeply human in the shape of it. She unfolded the paper, blank, wide, too wide. Her mind searched for words. What could she say? "I'm safe. They feed us. I slept on hay with a blanket and woke to bacon." Would her mother believe her? Would she hate her for surviving this way? She pressed the pencil to the paper and stopped. There was no sound but the wind slipping through the barn boards. The world waited, and then, carefully, she began. "Mother!" The first word cracked something in her chest. "I am alive!" She paused. Her breath shook. The pencil hovered again. "They told us we would be killed. That capture was shame, that nothing awaited us but pain. But it isn't like that." Each word cost her, but each word also gave something back. "The people here do not scream. They do not spit. They do not strike us. They smile sometimes. And they laugh, and they gave me food. Real food. I cried, but they did not mock me. They gave me a blanket. I still have it." The pencil scratched softly against the paper. She forgot the barn, forgot the hay, forgot even the war. There was only the shape of her thoughts and the silence she filled with meaning. "I thought we would die. I thought I wanted to, but I don't. Not now. I want you to know that I'm not cold, I'm not hungry, I'm still me." She stared at the words, simple, small. But they weren't just facts. They were rebellion, not against her family, but against everything she'd been taught, that Americans were monsters, that kindness was weakness, that mercy was a lie. This letter was truth, and truth, in the right hands, could be dangerous. She folded the paper carefully, her hands no longer shaking. She tucked it into the envelope the soldier had left behind, and when he passed by again, she handed it to him without a word. He nodded once, respectfully, and she watched him walk away, carrying not just a letter, but a fragment of the war itself, transformed, carrying the first words she had ever written in freedom. The bathing room was at the far end of the ranch, past the mess tent and a low fence where the horses were watered. Kiyomi followed the others in silence, her letter gone now, her hands empty, her chest strangely light. The building itself was plain, wooden walls, a slanted roof, no markings to suggest what waited inside. That uncertainty tightened her shoulders. In her world, rooms like this were where dignity was taken, not returned. Inside, steam fogged the air. The sound reached her before the sight, the steady rush of water, falling not in drops, but in streams. Hot water. The smell followed next. Clean, floral, soap. She stopped just inside the doorway. For a moment her mind refused to accept it. The girls ahead of her moved slowly, cautiously, as if walking into a dream that might break if they stepped too hard. A soldier stood to one side, eyes averted, handing each woman a towel, a bar of soap, and a change of simple clothing. No shouting, no instructions barked, just gestures. When the soap was placed in her hands, she nearly dropped it. It was heavier than she expected, smooth, white, real. She turned it over, pressing her thumb into its surface, half expecting it to crumble or vanish. The scent rose again, clean and unfamiliar, and something inside her throat tightened painfully. The showers lined the far wall, pipes exposed, water already running. One by one the women stepped beneath the streams. Some flinched when the heat touched their skin, unused to warmth that wasn't fire or fever. Others stood frozen, eyes closed, as if waiting for the moment the illusion would end. When Kiyomi stepped forward, the water hit her shoulders and she gasped. It soaked through her hair, ran down her spine, pooled at her feet. The dirt began to slide away immediately. Weeks of dust, sweat, dried blood, smoke. She raised the soap with trembling hands and pressed it to her skin. The lather bloomed instantly. She scrubbed her arms, her neck, her collarbones. Brown water spiraled down the drain. She scrubbed again and again, as if she could erase more than filth, as if the war itself might rinse away if she worked hard enough. A woman 2 stalls down began to cry, not quietly, not politely. She sobbed, shoulders shaking, hands braced against the wall as the water poured over her like rain after drought. No one stopped her. No guard barked an order. No one laughed. The crying echoed off the wooden walls, raw and unashamed, and then slowly faded into the hiss of water. Kiyomi found herself crying too, though she hadn't noticed when it started. The tears mixed with the steam vanished as soon as they fell. She reached for the small mirror hanging by a nail near her stall, hesitated, then looked. The face staring back at her startled her. It was thinner than she remembered, her cheeks hollowed, her eyes too large, but it was hers, clean, visible, not the gray mask of survival she had worn for so long. Her hair clung dark and wet to her temples. Her skin, her own skin, was no longer hidden beneath grime. She touched her cheek, slowly. A ghost had been living there, and now, somehow, a girl remained. When the water was turned off, the silence that followed felt immense, not awkward, not fearful, heavy with something like reverence. The women wrapped themselves in towels, steam rising around them like breath on a cold morning. Some smiled faintly, uncertain. Others simply stared at their hands, flexing fingers that felt newly theirs. Kiyomi dressed slowly, every movement deliberate. The clean clothes scratched lightly at her skin, unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. She folded her towel carefully, as if it mattered how she left it. Outside, the sun was bright, too bright. She blinked against it, her senses sharpened, the world suddenly loud and vivid. But when she looked around, no one was watching her with hunger or cruelty. The guards stood back, respectful. The cowboys talked quietly among themselves. For the first time since she could remember, she was not invisible, and she did not need to be afraid of being seen. They walked back to the barn together, wrapped in a silence that felt different now, not the silence of fear, but the silence that follows revelation. Something had been washed away, and something else, fragile, dangerous, alive, had taken its place. It began with a card game, simple, almost childish. A few cowboys sat outside the barn in the golden light of afternoon, passing time with playing cards worn soft from use. One waved at them, at the women, to join. Not all came. Most hesitated, but one girl did, and then another. And Kiyomi found herself walking forward, too, drawn not by curiosity, but by something harder to name. They taught her how to play, gestured with their hands, laughed when she got it wrong. Not mockery, real laughter, and when she finally laid down a winning hand, they clapped. Not loudly, not sarcastically, just kind. Then came the harmonica. Another prisoner, Sumiko, was handed one by a soldier. She didn't know how to play, but she blew through it anyway, shrieking with laughter at the strange squeaks it made. One cowboy mimicked the sound and fell off his chair in mock agony. The girls laughed, and then so did Kiyomi. It startled her. The sound, her own voice. Not the kind of laugh that came from politeness or pressure, but the sort that spills out before your mind can stop it. She caught herself and clamped her mouth shut. Her hand flew to her lips. Her heart raced, but nothing happened. No reprimand, no punishment, no shame, just a pause in the air, and then a smile from across the circle. Later that evening, by the fire, one of the men, maybe 25, sunburnt and dust-covered, asked her name. He didn't shout, he didn't demand, he just asked. "Kiyomi," she said softly, and he repeated it, carefully, respectfully. "Kiyomi." The syllables in his mouth were clumsy, but he tried, and when she nodded, he grinned. "Pretty name," he said. That was it. No performance, no agenda, just a name, spoken and returned. She looked around the fire, women sitting with cowboys, some talking, some silent, none afraid. That's when the rupture came. Because if these men, these supposed monsters, could look her in the eye, laugh at her jokes, play cards with her, offer soap and stew and music, then what did that say about everything she'd believed? What did it say about the whispers in the bunkers, the lessons in school, the orders barked by older men in rising panic as the empire crumbled? What did it say about the country that told her she'd be better off dead than dishonored? They had never asked her name, but her enemy had. She stared at the flames, the way they licked the wood gently, not in rage, but in rhythm. If they saw her as human, if these cowboys with dust on their shirts and soft drawls in their voices could offer her dignity, why hadn't her own country? Why had survival been shame? Why had care been weakness? Why had silence been the only language of obedience? Her stomach turned, not from the stew or the bacon, but from the quiet horror of knowing that kindness had come not from where it should have, but from where it never should have. And maybe that was the beginning of truth, a dangerous truth, but one she could no longer ignore. She smiled faintly into the firelight, and somewhere, deep down, the war inside her shifted. "Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Hundreds of miles across the Pacific, in a dimly lit room in Tokyo, a military clerk unfolded a letter written in a delicate hand. The paper was worn but intact, its words carefully written in a mix of formal script and familiar, aching simplicity. It was a message not meant for him, but like all outbound communication from captured soldiers, it had to pass through official eyes first. He scanned the first lines without much interest, then paused. "I am safe," it read. "They feed us. They treat us kindly. I am not afraid." The clerk looked up sharply. He read the words again and again. There was no code, no hidden meaning, no doublespeak or subtle cry for rescue. This wasn't a deception. It was something far more dangerous. It was the truth. In the eyes of the imperial military, that kind of truth was treasonous, not because it betrayed location or logistics, but because it challenged the story, the grand myth, the illusion of glory and martyrdom they had crafted like armor around every citizen's chest. The letter didn't say the Americans were good. It didn't need to. It simply showed they were not monsters, and that was enough. The letter was flagged, copied, placed in a file. The original? No one would ever see it again. Her mother would wait by the post box in vain, wondering why her daughter never wrote. But back in Texas, Kiyomi had no idea. All she knew was that she had spoken, that she had written what was real. And somehow, in doing so, something inside her had changed. She stood differently now. Not straighter, she had always stood with the posture of a drilled soldier, but looser, more certain of her own presence in the space she occupied. She didn't flinch when spoken to. She didn't avert her gaze when handed food. She even wore a ribbon. It was pink, soft, and strange. A gift from the rancher's young daughter who had seen Kiyomi helping in the kitchen and simply said, "Here, you should have something nice." Kiyomi had taken it with trembling fingers. She hadn't worn color since before the war, before the bombs, before the hunger, before girlhood was replaced by obligation. Now the ribbon fluttered in her hair as she walked across the yard to help carry water. No one commented on it. But they noticed. It wasn't just decoration. It was defiance. Not against the Americans, but against the silence, against the shame, against the idea that surviving kindly was less honorable than dying obediently. Her friends noticed the change, too. One whispered, "You seem lighter." Kiyomi didn't answer right away. She looked at the wind moving through the grass, the way the sun hit the barn roof just right. "I don't think I was meant to survive," she said. "Not like this, not with warmth, with music, with soap and food and ribbon." The other girl nodded. "But now that I have, I'm not giving it back." They said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. But for the first time, they sat on the porch steps as if they belonged there, not as prisoners, not even as guests, just as girls, human, whole. The war had tried to reduce them to shadows, to silence, to statistics, but a pencil, a slice of bacon, a song, and a ribbon had brought something back. And though her letter would never arrive, her truth had already traveled farther than she knew. It had taken root in Texas soil, in the eyes of the men who saw her, in the heart that still dared to hope. The announcement came at sunrise. A clipboard, a list, a few quiet names read aloud. Repatriation. A word they had barely dared to imagine was now real. It didn't come with celebration, just movement, orders, bags, a ship, a way back to something that used to be called home. Kiyomi stood beside the others, her feet no longer blistered, her shoulders no longer bent from hunger. Her body carried more weight now, not just in flesh, but in memory, in questions. She looked different. Not entirely, not dramatically, but her face no longer looked like it belonged in war. She wore a new shirt, a pale ribbon still tied neatly in her hair. Her name was printed clearly on a paper tag, affixed to her sleeve in black ink. Kiyomi Tanaka. Not prisoner, not enemy, just a name, spoken, seen. The truck ride to the coast was long, silent. Some girls cried. Others stared out the window, blinking into the sun. Kiyomi held her thoughts close, like folded letters in the pocket of her mind. At the port, the ship waited, a gray giant against the morning sky. Men moved with crates, ropes, orders barked in clipped tones, but it was the ramp that held her focus, the space between worlds. And then he was there, the cowboy, the same one who'd said that word to her. Home. He didn't speak now, just stood off to the side, arms crossed, hat low over his brow. When she caught his eye, he gave a small nod, then, slow and deliberate, tipped his hat. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was everything. She walked halfway up the ramp before something in her feet stopped moving. She turned. He was still there, watching, and from the distance, barely audible beneath the thrum of engines and shouts of sailors, she let the word rise from her chest. Home! This time, she said it. Not in disbelief, not in irony, but with choice, with meaning. The cowboy raised his chin just slightly, and then she turned back and kept walking. What awaited her in Japan was unknown. A shattered city? An empty house? A mother who never received her letter? She didn't know. But what she did know, what she would carry, was not the language of shame or silence or war. It was the taste of hot stew, the weight of a clean blanket, the sound of banjo strings and crackling fire. It was the laughter that escaped her lips without permission. It was a ribbon tied by a child's hand. It was soap and paper and a name said kindly. And it was a word, spoken once, then returned. The ship's horn bellowed, lines were drawn in, water churned below. As Texas faded behind her, she felt it, an ache, not of loss, but of remembering. And that was something no war could take. She had come as a ghost. She left as a woman, one who knew that sometimes dignity does not arrive in uniforms or medals, but in silence shared around a fire and names said with care. One who understood that even the smallest kindness could be an act of rebellion against cruelty, and one who would, for the rest of her life, remember a place that had no reason to treat her gently, yet did. A place that offered her, without fanfare or demand, a single, unforgettable word. Home. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a story the world nearly forgot.